That item is approved. We'll then move on to our discussion item, which is item number 10, and I'll invite the mayor and his team to determine their order.
Madam Chair, committee members.
Mr. Lutz, welcome.
Thank you. It's rare that I'm in front of the committee presenting.
We like it.
And so this afternoon, how we'd like to proceed is as follows. Mayor Ryback, followed by Rick Collins from Ryan Development, Dave Kwame from Wells Fargo, and then I'll give the staff presentation. We'll have a discussion after that, if that's acceptable.
We'll welcome the mayor then.
Jeff, you going to do that thumb drive thing? Thumb drive. Don't worry about it. That's fine. Don't worry about it. That's fine. Thank you very much, Madam Chair and committee members and audience. It's a very good moment here. If you look over in that corner there, in fact, Jen, would you hold that up? Sure. Our goal here is to move from that to, if you could hold the next one up, please.
I don't think the AV people like that. Let's have Jen move closer to you.
Good.
Ms. O'Rourke, could you step forward
Jen
and stand
O'Rourke,
near
my
the
very
mayor?
talented chief of staff, can do many, many things,
Vanna White
but I
over there,
didn't think
can you move
Vanna was
forward?
one of the things we'd ask her to do. Okay. This is basically what we're dealing with here, folks. Today, the possibility of white elephants surrounded by parking lots.
Okay, hang on. They're trying really hard to focus on it. Give them a second.
Here we go. A white elephant with parking lots. We want to change into this. But we want to do it in a way that represents the values of the people here, which include the fact that we don't subsidize office development, which includes the fact that we want to grow the tax base, not take property off the property tax rolls, which includes the fact that if a public investment is already going to be made, let's leverage the outcome. So the goal here is to do a 5-block redevelopment. It's a $400 million redevelopment that we are talking about over 5 blocks, but it's really 2 developments. One is an office development. It's about 1,660 square feet of office. That puts it about in the range of the IDS and City Center. It's slightly smaller than what we now call Capella Tower that was developed, I think, in 1991. 1991 was the last time we had an office development of any scale in downtown Minneapolis. Developing an office development of any scale is significant. Developing an office project that includes not a tenant but an owner, a company that intends to stay there, is critically important and a huge difference because it's about long-term investment and strategic approaches. But this is not just an office development that includes retail and some housing. What it is a second part of that development that is independent of it. It's a 2-block public park. That park, which we believe will be an enormous amenity for that part of town, is going to, we believe, spur not just the development here, but additional development around that. This has tax implications for us. As I mentioned, we are not putting property tax dollars into this. We are getting property taxes back out. In year 1, we estimate it will generate about $3.1 million in taxes for the city, county, and schools. About $1 million of that will come to the city of Minneapolis. If we take an extremely conservative 1% escalation in property values over the 30 years of the project, we'll obviously bring in about $30 million. If it escalates at about 3%, I think we'll bring in the $45, $50 million range. That's a lot of money. How are we going to do this? Well, the important part about how we're going to do this is that the part that I haven't mentioned yet, the least sexy part of it, is also the most critical part of it, and that's the public parking ramp that was already going to be built as part of the Viking Stadium. As you may remember, during that period of time, I was making a point that if any of those ramps are built for game day and are vacant the rest of the time, it will be a huge loss because it's a tremendous amenity. So what we did early on was identify that issue. We are really blessed to have what I believe, an exceptional development partner in this, in Ryan, who we worked very closely with, and the owners of the property of the Star Tribune, and said that if you take that ramp and you place a very large office tenant next to it, 6,000, 7,000 employees, that ramp becomes a very valuable generator of income. It will be enough to pay for that ramp, but also to pay for what we call the yard, this public park. And that's really what's going on here. Instead of using public money, instead of using tools like tax increment, what we're really doing is taking an existing public investment that was part of the stadium deal, the ramp, and using that, putting it next to an office tenant and generating the dollars for the yard and the other parts of that. None of the actions that you're taking today have any implication for whether we agree or don't agree with the development deal that I outlined in a very, very brief way just now. We do want you to understand the overall concept of that, and obviously we've briefed all of you and we'll continue to do that. The main issue in front of us really has more to do with the land use here, and I would argue that the two images I showed are really critical. I was a reporter at the Star-Tribune in 1979, and it was an area with a successful media operation surrounded by a bunch of parking lots. I think we're blessed to say the Star-Tribune is a successful media operation today, but the world has changed, and it no longer needs a building anywhere that scale. And so as they move out, as they're planning, we are faced with the option of either acting or winding up with an area of town that has continued to be surrounded with parking lots, but now with an empty office building there. I believe this is a far greater outcome, and I want to turn it over to Chuck to get into some of the details, and I'll obviously be available for questions.
So I think we'll hear next from Wells Fargo, or from Ryan. Sorry. Mr. Collins, welcome.
Thank you, Madam Chair, council members. My comments will be brief. It was about 10 years ago that I stood here talking with you about what now has become Midtown Exchange, which is a very significant redevelopment down in South Minneapolis that we were pleased to work on. And as is always the case on a project this complicated, I may be standing here, but I represent a large team of people. In fact, 3 of my colleagues are here today. Starting at the end, Bob Parr, Director of Development, who also worked very closely on Midtown Exchange. Mike Ryan, who heads up Ryan's Architecture and Engineering Unit, and our CEO, Pat Ryan, has joined us as well today. So we appreciate the chance to visit with you briefly. Like Midtown Exchange, this is an opportunity to make a significant transformation in a currently significantly underdeveloped part of the city of Minneapolis. It will take a lot more work beyond what we've done so far today, but we have achieved significant accomplishments already. It was publicly reported last week that we received a contract nod from the Minnesota Sports Facilities Authority for the parking ramps and skyways that are part of this plan. We've worked through many of the details for a financing plan for the park, the yard, and we have a preliminarily but significant interest from our corporate user, Wells Fargo. You'll hear momentarily from Mr. Kwame. And there are about 6 or 7 more months of very hard work ahead of us. We hope to be back in front of you at the end of the year with more to approve. But at this point, I'm here primarily to stand for your questions after we get through the presentation. So thank you again for this opportunity to work with staff. Chuck Lutz has been, I'm not sure where Chuck is, right behind me. Chuck Lutz has been a tremendous leader of his staff, and there are many others, just like on the Ryan team, many others on the city team, making this happen, for which we're appreciative. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Collins. Mr. Kwame, welcome.
Madam Chair, council members, my name is Dave Kwame. I'm CEO of Wells Fargo, Minnesota. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. Wells Fargo is committed to the city of Minneapolis. We're a leading employer and taxpayer in the city. We've partnered well with the city on many issues over several years, and we look forward to continuing to work together on items that are mutually important to both of us. We're excited about the Ryan development. We believe it has the opportunity to transform downtown, particularly the east side of downtown. Your meeting today and future council meetings are important signals of the project's viability and progress. As you know, we are in discussions with Ryan. Should this project receive the necessary reviews and approvals and we can come to an agreement with Ryan, our goal is to become the owner of 12 stories in each of the 2 proposed 20-story towers. Wells Fargo is a significant employer. We have over 250,000 team members across the country. 20,000 of those team members are based here in Minnesota, including 12,000 in the city of Minneapolis. Many of those 12,000 team members in the city of Minneapolis are in leased office space, with leases coming up for renewal over the next 2 to 3 years. And our ability to move into owned space in the city of Minneapolis would be significant to us in terms of stabilizing our employment base here in the city of Minneapolis. We find the site attractive because of its proximity to the river, light rail transit, the University of Minnesota, the Vikings, the Guthrie, and the proposed park. And it's a very exciting opportunity for us, and I'm open to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you very much.
Are there any questions for Mr. Kwame? Councilmember Samuels.
Yeah, thank you for being here, Mr. Kwame. Just a question about, is there going to be any additional staff coming from outside of the current in downtown staffing that you have?
I think that's an important question for us to work on over the next few years as this project is developed. The way I would characterize it today is that, again, of our 12,000 team members downtown, many of those team members are in leased space, and much of that space is such that we're going to be exercising our rights to move out of that space and to move those team members somewhere else. Those team members could go into owned space downtown, they could go into other leased space downtown, or they could go somewhere else. And what we find exciting about this is it's an opportunity for us to ensure that a significant number of the team members that are in leased space will be housed in owned space that will improve our stability of our employment here in the city of Minneapolis. And so it really strengthens the likelihood that we'll have more team members in Minneapolis 3 years from now, as opposed to not doing this project.
Further questions? Thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
Mr. Lutz.
Madam Chair, for the record, I'm Chuck Lutz, Deputy Director of CPED. With me, in addition to Mayor Ryback, is our staff project team, Kevin Carpenter, Susan Siegel, and I don't know if Paul Austin's here or not, but that's our primary staff team working on this project. We're all here to answer questions once I conclude the staff presentation, as well as Rick Collins and Dave Kwame. What we're asking the committee to do today is take two actions. Number one, to receive and file the general conceptual framework for the project as outlined in the staff report. And second, to authorize staff to develop a funding plan and negotiate term sheets and other agreements with Ryan, MSFA, and then bring them back to City Council for approval. The first thing that I want to do is talk about the site. And in your packet are two maps. The first map, we will show you both of them quickly and then go back to the first map. The first map is showing the 5 blocks of the Ryan development in downtown East. And the second map is showing a little broader frame, which includes the 5 blocks I just outlined, plus 2 additional blocks, which are important to this presentation. And Miles Mercer will be working the overhead for me today as we move through this. So the two maps in front of you are part of your report. The Ryan development is located on the 5 blocks in downtown East, roughly bounded by 5th Avenue on the west, Chicago Avenue on the east, 3rd Street on the north, and 5th Street on the south. The Star Tribune Company, as you know, currently owns these 5 blocks. And the blocks consist largely of surface parking, along with three buildings, 425 and 329 Portland and 700 4th Street South, all of which would be demolished. As the mayor has indicated, what Ryan is proposing to do on these blocks is to develop approximately 1 million square feet of office space in 2 20-story office towers on the 2 blocks bounded by 3rd Street, 4th Street, Park Avenue, and 5th Avenue on your map. Basically, it's blocks 2 and 3. Second, a parking ramp of approximately 1,300 stalls on the McClellan, which we call the McClellan block, which is the block bounded by Chicago Avenue, Park Avenue, 3rd Street, and 4th Street. It's block 1 on the map that's on your screen. Third, approximately 300 to 350 multifamily housing units that would line the 2 office towers. Ryan or another party may also develop approximately 45 units on the south side of the McClellan parking ramp. Fourth, approximately 40,000 square feet of retail space integrated into both the office and residential development. Fifth, as the mayor pointed out, skyways that would connect all the way from the Hoff ramp, which is just to the west here, through the northerly 3 blocks, through McClellan, and then ultimately to the stadium. And then finally, what we call a basic park, or as the mayor has dubbed it, the yard, which would be developed on the 2 blocks bounded by 4th Street, 5th Street, 5th Avenue, and Park Avenue, which are blocks 4 and 5 on your map. The yard would be actively programmed for public and other events occurring in the stadium, but also for other community events. In addition to these elements, Ryan has proposed to build and manage, and this is why the other map, we will switch to the other map right now, a ramp on behalf of the Stadium Authority located on Block 7, which is the block to the north of the stadium, and also Block 6, which is the Downtown East ramp, which is just east of the stadium. And these ramps are important for the repayment of the bonds, which I'll describe in just a minute. I now want to move into project funding and financing. Total development costs of the project are estimated to be well over $400 million. Ryan would privately finance the office, residential, and retail developments at a cost of about $350 million. Wells Fargo would purchase the buildings from Ryan, and there would be about 5,000 to 6,000 employees located on the site. The Minnesota Sports Facilities Authority, or MSFA, would fund approximately $35 million of project costs for the construction of skyways, the parking ramp that I mentioned north of the stadium, and a portion of the McClellan parking ramp. This MSFA funding is part of the overall stadium project budget of $975 million. The city would finance approximately $65 million of project costs for the yard, a portion of the McClellan ramp, and other non-park project costs.
So, Mr. Lutz?
Yes.
Can you speak to the other non-park project costs?
That would be things like environmental remediation, removal of foundations, and things of that nature. A portion of which, Madam Chair, would be applying for, likely we try to apply for all of it, from other sources as we work with our partners from DEED, Met Council, and Hennepin County.
But Ryan would be seeking that money from other sources.
Yes.
We're only funding this. We're not financing
Right.
it. So.
That's right. No, and what would happen, Madam Chair, is that assuming that let's assume for a second we achieve a significant amount of the other project costs from other sources, that would then presumably could reduce the bond amount that would be needed for the project.
Or it could free up money for other
Yes.
larger portions, like a larger reserve or
Yes.
other portions of the yard.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Okay. A fully developed and improved yard is estimated to require an additional $10 to $15 million in capital expenditures, initial funding of which could come from the sale of development rights and sponsorships. And as I mentioned, we would be seeking outside funding for environmental remediation, for other extraordinary site preparation costs, et cetera. The city would finance this portion of the project costs through the sale of general obligation bonds. And to repay the bonds, Ryan companies would make scheduled, predetermined payments to the city to contribute to the annual debt service for a minimum of 10 years of parking ramp operations. Ryan companies will make its payments from revenues it receives managing the McClellan ramp, which is Block 1 on your map, and the ramp north of the stadium, which we call the Block 7 ramp, and also the Downtown East ramp on Block 6. And as I mentioned, Ryan's payment obligation is for a minimum of 10 years. If it ends, the city would receive all net operating income from the 3 parking facilities and would use that revenue to pay debt service. If the amount of the debt service is not sufficient to cover the debt service on the parking ramp issuance, MSFA would pledge annual appropriations to the city to cover any debt service shortfall. Any parking revenues in excess of the amount needed to cover debt service on the parking ramp issuance would be shared with MSFA. If the city's share of revenue from the ramps is not sufficient to recover the remaining debt service on the park bond issuance, the city could use other general fund resources to make the debt service payments for the yard. The city and or MSFA would have the option in their sole discretion to terminate Ryan's operation of the parking ramps after a minimum of 3 years, which would also terminate Ryan's payment obligation to the city and trigger a possible repayment obligation to Ryan. During the period when the Ryan payment obligation is in place, the net operating income from the ramps in any individual year could be less than the amount of that year's payment obligation for Ryan. Discussions about how to handle this circumstance are ongoing with both Ryan and the MSFA. I just want to mention briefly some other components of the project as well. First of all, Ryan companies would have an option to purchase from the city the westerly 1/3 of, or approximately 36,000 square feet of the west yard block, which is block 4 on the map, which is immediately across the street from the jail, if you can picture that, between 4th Street and 5th Street along 5th Avenue. That right extends through July of 2016. If Ryan does not exercise its option, the city could market the land for other development or retain it as part of the yard. Second, I mentioned previously, there are development rights potentially over and adjacent to the McClellan ramp, including the south side facing the yard, which would be offered for sale for future development. That would require structural changes to the ramp, to the McClellan ramp, to accommodate air rights over the ramp. I now want to focus in on the yard just very briefly. The yard would be a major new park amenity in downtown Minneapolis. It would be available for use by the public year-round, as well as by MSFA and Minnesota Vikings for a specified number of days each year. Generally, the design and programming of the yard would focus on entertainment and event purposes on the eastern block, which is the block closest to the stadium, block 5 on your map, and recreational purposes on block 4, which is the western block. Staff and MSFA have been engaged in discussions about uses of the yard, which would ultimately be reflected in an agreement between the city and MSFA that would address, among other matters, the following. Number one, a collaborative process for planning and designing the yard itself. Number two, use of the yard for Vikings games and Vikings-related events, MSFA events, including special events such as an NCAA Final Four tournament, Major League Soccer franchise, etc. Third, rules for temporary structures within the yard, including tents, portable toilets, lighting, signage, etc. And finally, a definition of event day expenses and what expenses would be covered by MSFA and or the Vikings. One of the questions that comes up quite frequently is the status of Park and Portland Avenues. Both those streets are county roads, and the county decides how they're operated. Based on conversations with the county, there's little interest at this time, at least, in permanent closure. However, the streets could be closed temporarily during Vikings and MSFA events to provide continuity to the yard. The streets may also be redesigned to be narrowed and have a more park-like feel. MSFA and the Vikings would have exclusive control of concessions and marketing in the yard, or a portion thereof during their events. And it's anticipated that MSFA would seek an expansion of its premises, its current premises, for its liquor license to include the yard for MSFA and Vikings events. And then finally, the city's in the process of undertaking an alternative urban area-wide review for the project, which is an alternative to a traditional EIS. In addition, the project would undergo review through the city's land use approval process, which is called a planned unit development, or PUD, for several site plan and design issues, including signage, with the name of the anchor office user, Wells Fargo. I want to emphasize that this report today does not convey any development rights or governmental approvals. Decisions on all land use applications would be made through the applicable city process. And so in closing, as I said at the beginning, we're asking the committee to do two things: receive and file the general conceptual framework and authorize staff to move forward to develop a funding plan and term sheets that are consistent with the report that's before you today. Thank you.
Are there any questions for Mr. Lutz? We'll start with questions, then we'll move to comments. Councilmember Lilligren, followed by Councilmember Gordon.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Mr. Lutz, and to everyone that presented here. And we don't usually see the committee room this full, and I think it just is really symbolic of all of the people that are interested in this, that are working on this project as well, both in the private sector and within the public sector. And I have a few questions, and I think I'll start with one that's relative to the site, and it has to do with transit planning and the future Viking Stadium. And I'm a non-voting member of the Metropolitan Council Transportation Committee, and just last night we had a presentation on what their needs are going to be relative to transit planning in the area. And I don't know if this is Metro Transit's target or if it's the MSFA's target, but they have a 40% transit mode target for the stadium, which is a lot of people. And over the next few years, we'll be adding 2 additional light rail lines, the Southwest and hopefully Botno LRT, to this area. So that'll add an additional 30,000 plus customers at this station. And I know they have some very particular needs about pedestrian access, staging buses for events, and also they're very interested in establishing a permanent bus layover facility for regular service somewhere within this map that touches a number of the blocks that are proposed for future development. And so I'm not asking for a solution today, Mr. Lutz, but I'm just wondering how within this very complicated project that again involves significant private and public jurisdictions, how those kinds of solutions are going to be found.
And Mayor Ryback. Yeah. Madam Chair and Councilmember Lilligren, you're touching on a collection of issues that are very, very important to us, and we're about an eighth of the way down the road on this. Here are a couple of the issues. Number one, when we looked at this site for stadium planning, we recognized that it will be even busier than the Twins ballpark because it will have two lines crossing. So the first thing we wanted to do was to say, let's not put all our dependence on one stop. At the same time, there was discussion about what would be the best way for cars to come around this area. And Steve Kotke, our Public Works Director, made a very wise choice, which relates to all this, which may sound tangential, but it's critically important, to really look at the long-term goal of having people from St. Paul come in not on 5th Street, but onto 7th Street. During that period of time, we applied for a grant, and we thankfully just got that. Mm-hmm. Here's how this all connects. The long-term vision is from St. Paul, you'll come in on 7th Street. The existing exit ramp can then be used for pedestrian link to the West Bank. So if you really look at that, there's not just one stop here, there's another stop on a totally different station. And so that link to the West Bank by pedestrians all of a sudden makes the West Bank transit stop very close to the stadium. So the first goal is just on game days, spread it out over 2 stops and 2 lines. The second issue touches on something Met Transit hasn't solved, which is if you look again at what's happening by Target Field, the interchange, a $70 million project is being built, bringing all of this together, and we right now have no plan for that stop. Stadium, Ryan development, the yard, whatever, we don't have that plan. So we're looking very hard at that, and we've had very early conversations about with Metro Transit about that. We're also looking at the long haul use of their buses, et cetera. So there's a lot of work being done in that, and it's just beginning, and I think we'll need your expertise, obviously, on that as it moves forward.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Mr. Mayor. Thanks for that. And I think those service reforms are excellent and will serve the stadium well. And again, it's the more physical sort of things, the bus layover, the for special events, permanent bus layover, and just the queuing area at the station, I think is going to be a challenge as well. My next question has to do, and I don't know if this is for you, Mr. Lutz, or if it's maybe for Mr. Collins, even from Ryan, but I think that this is a good analogy between this and the Midtown Exchange in the way that they are potentially transformational developments. And I think one of the things that was strongly acknowledged by the city and by Ryan on the Midtown Exchange was that transformation was more than just a physical thing, but it had to do with the people, the community. And I have a couple questions kind of relative to the people and the community on this project. And Ryan did groundbreaking work in a number of areas on the Midtown Exchange and involving the community. One of those was workforce participation and then the high level of women and minority participation in skilled, unskilled, and contractors. And of course, the city was in more of the driver's seat. We owned that property and we could set some very high goals in partnership with Ryan and then establish ways to meet them. And I'm just wondering at this point what the plans for participation goals on this project might be.
Madam Chair, Councilmember Lilligren, Midtown Exchange provided us a very important opportunity to learn a lot about the inclusion of minorities and females in our workforce and also how to perform outreach to women and minority-owned businesses. And that has been integrated into our procedures all along since. One of the obligations that we committed to by virtue of being awarded the MSFA parking ramp and skyway contract was to operate under the same equity plan that is being implemented for the stadium itself. It's got very significant and aggressive goals for the inclusion of minorities and females, both in tradespeople and in business ownership. Similarly, Wells Fargo has very specific objectives of its own for diversity in the supplier base that serves Wells Fargo. We will be implementing goals related specifically to their part of the development. And now that we have become more mature in how to do this on an ongoing basis as a construction and development company, we have already begun the outreach looking forward into this project. We're involved in a similar project right now in downtown St. Paul. The the Lower Town Ballpark that also has very significant goals with respect to workforce and supplier participation and diversity. And so it is a commitment we're prepared to make and pleased to make and intend to follow up on.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Constantine, as someone who was there as you started on that journey with the Midtown Exchange, it's been really rewarding, and I commend Ryan Companies for the work that they've done in incorporating that in your regular business model and incorporating participation. And I have another kind of groundbreaking thing I think you did on Midtown Exchange, or at least it seemed groundbreaking to me as a member of the Phillips community, was how you engage the community around the project itself. And again, acknowledging that for that project to be successful, it needed to be owned by the community. And so this is going to sit in the middle of a few neighborhoods in the city of Minneapolis. And so I'm wondering what your plans through the pre-development and development are to engage the surrounding community.
Thank you for your question, Councilmember Lilligren. In fact, Mike Ryan and I, on June 24th, participated in a neighborhood presentation to 4 separate neighborhoods at the Open Book on Washington Avenue. And I think we played to a packed house. I would guess between 80 and 100 people. And I know the room became very warm. It must have been a humid day then, too. So we began our community engagement early on, and at that point we also collected email addresses from those who were present and made an offer that we have since followed up on to link them to our project website. And so it is our plan to involve them in communication during the planning process. We've committed on behalf of others, candidly, that there would be a lot of community discussion about the yard and its design and its programming. But there will be multiple opportunities for them to engage with us. One of the things we did at Midtown that we found beneficial was a midway through construction, we held a hard hat tour for those who were interested in coming. And I'm sure we'll do something similar here to let people participate, not just in the grand opening, but also in the preparation of the buildings themselves. And so we'll roll out a more specific plan as we get further into the project.
Thank you, Mr. Collins. Madam Chair, my final question, this might be for Ms. Oh, sure. I'm sorry.
Madam Chair and Council Member, it's important to also note that that this partnership with Ryan is a partnership in which they will physically be building the yard, but the development of the yard itself is under the control of the city. And I mention that because as far as this issue of engaging the community, along with all that great work that Mr. Collins just talked about, there's a separate process that we really need to go through about creating this great public amenity. So our vision is to create an implementation committee that includes outreach to different parts of the community that is educated very much by the very rich implementation process that's been very inclusive of the community that we've had at the stadium district. So there's a lot of body of work out there. There's an additional part of that. And if this passes, I'll be coming back to this body with the idea of an implementation committee that we can talk about as a way to really have that public space be something that includes great thinking from the public.
Thank you. And Madam Chair, Mr. Mayor, this actually feeds directly into my final question, which is about the yard and the future plans for the yard. And I think to be very clear in setting a baseline with the public and with their expectations of what may happen there. And so I'm wondering if either you, Mr. Mayor, or if maybe Mr. Lutz would talk about what day one, what the state of the yard might be at when it's fully programmed and operational, what it might look like, and what might the capital costs be, and what might some of the sources be, again, acknowledging this is all projection.
Madam Chair, Council Member, the development deal we have includes funds to acquire the 2 blocks and do a straightforward grass and trees operation. That's very nice, but it's certainly not the aspiration that I have for this, nor is it the transformative work that we need. So it's clear that we need to look for additional resources, which I've continued to do as we modify this, as we look at air rights over places. And so there are additional resources we need to bring into this. As well, we are looking to the idea of potentially the philanthropic community and the sponsor community. This gets a little more detail. I won't go on to all the point, but the fact of the matter is they're going to be selling a bunch of sponsorships inside the stadium. We can't violate those, but we may be able to piggyback on them, but those are going to have to, there's a complicated dance in all of it. So the bottom line is we don't frankly know exactly what the yard is going to look like. Even when you look at issues like the roads, and I've encouraged the county to just work with us a little bit. We want a continuous park experience from essentially where the jail is all the way to the front door of the stadium. We have parks that have roads through them. We have parks that have no roads in them. I would imagine none of them look like Park and Portland do today, but I think there are models that can be open and models that can be closed. Let's punt on that issue to good planning. Let's also take a while to look at what kind of use is in there. I think we have aspirations for more use on that, but that's all part of this implementation committee. And there's an intersection of money and use that we're going to have to get into.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Councilmember Lilligren, I will note, though, given that I represent this entire area, and even after the redistricting, I'll represent half of it, that the Elliott Park Neighborhood Association has taken a position in favor of Ryan's concept approval, which is a big step, I think. In addition, the East Downtown Council has taken a position in favor of the concept approval. So these are formal recommendations by the two organizations that we count on to give us some leadership in this area. And I will note, Elliott Park has also been instrumental and active in the Vikings conversation and at the table, and I think tremendously helpful. So there is a lot of involvement by the Elliott Park neighborhood, and all the other downtown neighborhoods are working with them in order to see this concept approval go forward.
And Madam Chair, if I might add, a few weeks ago, Rick Collins and the Ryan team came to the Stadium Implementation Committee, and the Implementation Committee voted to support the development as well. And so it speaks volumes about the relationship between these two projects, because they are very much interrelated.
Councilmember Gordon.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate the discussion, all the presentations, and the great potential here is pretty enormous. I want to focus in a little bit on the public investment, the city investment of $65 million and what we're getting for that. I'm most concerned about that, and also about the public park that we end up with. So maybe you could just tell me, we're borrowing $65 million. We've used some expressions about financing, funding. I'm not sure what it means. Where does it go to? Who then gets that? And trace me through those steps, and then how we end up in the end. I believe, what do we actually own, which I think is some surface parking lots. But can you help me out here?
Maybe I can start by helping out a little bit about this. So we're like a bank. We're operating like a bank. They're coming to us and borrowing money. We're going to issue bonds, and the stream of revenue from the parking will pay back the bonds. We will not own the ramp.
We won't. I don't care about the stream of parking money. I just want to know about the $65 million. So we're going to have to issue bonds. We're actually going to get the money from someone else. We're not a bank. We don't have $65 million we're going to just give out. So maybe if Mr. Carpenter could just help me kind of in simple terms, I could understand.
Simple term, Councilmember Gordon.
Who do we give the $65 million to? I'll give you a small question.
Madam Chair, Councilmember Gordon, members of the committee, we will borrow $65 million approximately. 40 plus million of that, between 40 and 45, will go to pay for the building of the ramp.
Do we give that to the sports facility?
Sports Facilities Authority will own the ramp. We will be financing it. So we will pay for the building of it. We will also use 20 to 25 million from the 65 to purchase the land for the yard and make, as the mayor said, the basic improvements there to tear down the existing structure and put into place grass and the trees and the basic park. Over time, we then, having borrowed the money, have to pay the debt service on that. The way we are acting only as a bank is because the money that comes to us through this to-be negotiated set of arrangements, first from Ryan's unconditional corporate guarantee, will go into our pot of money that we use to repay the money that we borrowed to build the ramp. So we are neutralized from any direct exposure on the ramp money. As it relates to the yard money, if they're assuming that there's likely to be significant excess revenue from the cash flows off these three parking facilities.
So can I just stop? Because the cash flow I didn't have as many questions about.
Okay.
I just wanted to be able to figure out who actually is getting the 65. It sounds like you said 45 million is going to go to the Sports Authority so they can build the parking ramp.
It actually, we fund the building of the ramp that the Sports Facilities Authority will own.
Okay, and so while it's being constructed, we will control how it's constructed, and that's still our money, or who's kind of then in charge of that? Don't we turn that over to them to handle that?
Pursuant, as I understand it, pursuant to the Sports Facilities Authority recent decision to award the parking contract to Ryan, Ryan will be building it, so we're going to
Okay.
actually.
So it'll go
Funding it.
flow through them to Ryan to construct it. And the other part then is there 20 million then left, and we're buying the 2-block public park land from Ryan. So the 20 million then goes to Ryan for the purchase of that property.
Ryan will be purchasing it from the Star Tribune, who currently owns it. We will be purchasing it from Ryan, assuming this all goes through, and we will own then those 2 blocks.
Do we know how much Ryan is paying for the 2 blocks?
I believe it's the same as we've talked about, exactly what we're paying them for it. They aren't making money on the land for the yard.
Okay, so it's they're paying 20 million for the.
The land itself is is a big fraction of the 20, because the other part we're paying $5 or $6 million to improve the land. So the raw land purchase is $14, $15, $16 million, and the improvements there too are $5, $6, or $7 million to get it to basic park status. All of which is in city ownership once the whole thing is done.
Okay. Do we know how that compares to the $71 per square foot or the 2.5 million option to buy? You know what I'm talking about? Because I think even though we're buying it all from Ryan, they still have an option to buy some of it back, and we've already set the price.
You want to talk about the development piece of this?
With respect to the westerly 1/3 of the block of the yard, that is going back to block 4 on your map. Ryan would have the option of purchasing that from the city for $71 a square foot, or roughly $2.5 million. $71 per square foot, I believe, is the same or very close to what they're paying the Star Tribune for its land. So we're not making a profit off them. They're not making a profit off us.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I appreciate that. And so that means we'll have some money to clean up the parking lot. Sounds like about $5 million.
The land itself would be about $15 to $16 million of that approximately $20 million. So the rest then would be for purposes of building out the quote unquote basic park as defined in your report, which is essentially a grassy field in the first instance, to be followed by improvements.
I appreciate that. And I'm also wondering, has there been discussions with the park board about their ultimate future ownership of this public park?
Yes, Madam Chair and Council Member, yes, we have. One of the things that's important, however, is that the authority and the developer and everyone else, that as complicated as this is, they didn't want an additional governmental layer on in the midst of these negotiations. And so we all agreed that we would strike a use agreement with the authority and Ryan and everyone in that area, and then we, the city, would have the option of where the ownership should be. It's my personal position that it would be appropriate for us to work with the park board on that, to operate it under our guidance, but that's the decision. And Madam Chair, if I could, Councilmember, one thing that, as you were talking about the financing, that's been helpful for me and was certainly my guide in the negotiations, is that it is appropriate, in my mind, the way the Councilmember was talking about it, of a bank. Basically, we're financing something that'll create some cash. But the biggest issue to me was, what's the risk to taxpayers? And so how do we really talk about that? Well, you don't want to risk our property tax base at all. So what's really the risk here? So what I said is, what happens if nobody parks in the ramp? Well, the first 10 years, that's Ryan's problem. And until it cash flows for a couple of years, that's really their problem. We're sympathetic, but that's their problem, right? So it's, yeah, there you are, Rick. We'll be with you there, boy, but we're not paying. So that's, so let's say it's cash flowing. So then year 11 through 30, let's say a disaster hits. Even though it's cash flowing at that time and it's cash flowed for a couple of years, if some miracle or the opposite of, absolutely nobody parked in that ramp for 20 years, our total exposure would be roughly about $30 million. Now, meanwhile, you may have remembered the tax point that I made before. Very conservatively, we'll be generating an additional $30 million in property tax in this area. So in a worst-case scenario, if property values only go up 1% in town, and we only bring in $30 million in additional property taxes, and if absolutely nobody parks in that ramp, it's kind of a wash. That's the absolute worst-case scenario. It's a wash with a park, is basically the way I look at it.
So I have two other things I wanted to ask about, and this might be for finance director. I'm not sure. I guess maybe there's a third thing that I'm kind of curious about. But one is the park dedication fee, and how does that fit in here? I understand that this is a new statute that is passed. We haven't figured out all the details. I also know that it has, in lieu of actually paying the fee, many alternatives, and it seems like we could. Somehow in the transfer of this land to become a park, it could be in there. But have you thought about whether or not this applies and how? And if they were going to just pay the fee and not provide any of these alternative compliances, what would the fee be?
Madam Chair, Councilmember Gordon, first of all, when the ordinance on park dedication fee originally passed the City Council and Park Board back in 2009, one of the, and I was in the middle of all those discussions.
You sure were. You did a great job. Appreciate that.
Thank you. One of the keys to getting that the park dedication fee passed was the idea that downtown developers could dedicate, instead of paying a fee, could dedicate land in lieu of, and could designate a plaza. Most major skyscrapers, including the Ryan buildings, will be having plazas in front of their buildings. That would count in lieu of the payment of a park dedication fee. So that in lieu of option came about because of negotiations that I had with the Downtown Council, BOMA, and the Chamber of Commerce, which was interested in not having huge fees being added on to development costs of projects.
Okay, I appreciate that. Another thing that occurred to me has to do with the charter and this $15 million requirement. Now, have we figured out whether or not this somehow would trigger that, or how are was there a plan to avoid triggering that, and what's that plan? Because there's something about if we actually bond for $15 million for some construction or improvements, public improvements and construction, it requires a referendum?
Right. Madam Chair and Councilmember Gordon, it depends on the way the bond issue is structured and what kinds of bonds are used. And so the $15 million cap would apply for bonds issued through the Board of Estimate and Taxation, but there are other methods for doing it through using an industrial development district or other means of bonding.
And are we assuming that we're going to, does the council have to designate this an industrial development district? Have we done that yet?
Madam Chair and Councilmember Gordon, if that was the path that was chosen, if the City Council decided it wanted to proceed further with this proposal and wanted to use that kind of financing, then yes, that would be a step that the council would need to take.
Ms. Siegel, what did we do when we funded the Heart Hospital? What did we do when we funded Children's Hospital? What did we do when we funded Fairview? Those were all over $15 million.
Those were all done with.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, those particular issues were all done as conduit issues to which those general parameters don't apply. There is, however, also a set of commonly used City Council approved and Board of Estimate and Taxation approved issuances that do not fall under the $15 million referendum cap. That's a specific subset of not all our issuances. We frequently go through both council and BET to do general obligation financings that are in excess of $15 million that are not subject to referendums. If we chose that route Here, we would go exactly like we do with every other general obligation bond financing of that route, which would be through council and through BET, or alternatively, as Ms. Siegel was talking about, we could take this other route. It is absolutely indifferent from a financial perspective. You get to the same answer either way.
Okay.
Hope that
Councilmember
helps.
Gordon, you have the floor.
Thank you. And maybe my last question is for Ryan. A sticking point here for me a little bit is this option to buy. And it sounds like that it would be nailed down and it would be Ryan's decision to buy or not, and we wouldn't have any authority to say, oh, we don't want to sell it to you now, back to you, this little third of the, or big, 36,000 square foot. If that wasn't on the table, would this be a deal breaker for you? And if so, what is the likelihood you think you're going to want to get that back? Because it's almost to me now having that 2-block park is what's the most appealing. Something really for the public, something that can serve the residents into the future. And what I want to see is how we can actually scrape together the money, even out of the deal, to actually have a full functioning park. We should at least have some facility there and other things. But I'm worried I'll get pulled in by that, all the allure of that, and then all of a sudden the park will start shrinking on me, and we'll be giving back parkland, and I'm reluctant to do that. So maybe you could just talk a little bit and try to make.
Madam Chair, Councilmember Gordon, I'd be happy to make a few comments, and I sense the mayor may want to add some as well. First of all, I wouldn't stand in front of a committee like this and use the term deal breaker, but it's very important to us that this development option is there and available to us. It's structured in a way that allows us, until what would otherwise be the opening of the park, to make a decision, make a commitment, and move forward. And so it's not something that stays out there for a long time. And we do anticipate at this point that we would exercise that option, subject to how the housing and other markets continue to improve. It's likely that if we exercised an option there, we would do so in a way to add a development that would not only be a self-contained development, but would have a park-facing side to it that might include features like are currently at Lake Harriet or Lake Calhoun or Minnehaha Falls that have some retail or restaurant orientation to the park, perhaps provide additional amenities for park users in concert, in partnership with the park board or with the city of Minneapolis. And we also will be very sensitive, and others will as well, to the height of any project on that site. One of our corporate users' objectives is to make sure, for instance, that views from their offices of the downtown skyline aren't imposed on by any development we might have on that site. We anticipate at this point a low-rise development that would be unlikely to be any higher than the existing jail wall right across Fifth Avenue. With that, I'd be happy to turn it over to the mayor if you have further questions or comments.
Mayor Ryback, let me just also say to Councilmember Gordon, I share your concern, but in a different direction. I would rather have the money to build out the park. So I don't think we're going to find money falling from trees, $2.5 million, that we're going to be able to use to get a field, an amphitheater, permanent structures, and I don't want to look at the jail wall either. So I'm more interested that they're not paying enough for the option because they're paying the unimproved price versus the improved price. So everyone comes to it from a totally different direction, but I think in the end what we're going to find is there isn't going to be enough money to build this out, and that might be a source.
Madam Chair and Council Member, you rightfully show two different parts of this issue. On one hand, is it better to have a larger yard or better to have a smaller yard that is better funded? It's such an interesting quandary that I have actually very effectively argued both sides of that at different points in these negotiations. And so Ryan is being very, very polite in this, because here's how this worked. They proposed the 2 blocks. I said, it's a whole long way from the jail to the park. We're looking for ways to bring revenue in. What if we sold back part of it and I think Mr. Collins has touched on this, what if we had this retail facing along there, a sea salty, tin fishy kind of place that could generate revenue for ongoing operations? Well, I thought it was a brilliant guy doing all of that. As this has gone through and as we've looked at other things, I sheepishly turned to my partners, who I helped convince of this, and said, gee, I kind of think we might need those whole 2 blocks. So I what you're talking about, and I am partially responsible for the quandary we are in, but that's part of what we're just going to have to do. We've never done a project of this scale. We don't know really how big it's going to be between there and the stadium, because remember,
Show them on the map where the stadium's going to
Thank
be.
you, Lisa. I'm glad you asked.
Thank you. We had this
the
conversation
stadium.
yesterday. That's why
Yeah.
I'm laughing about it.
So this is where it is right now, and so you think, gee, you've got a couple blocks until that happens, but right there, the stadium is going to start where that white line is. So all of that you see now as stadium is plaza. If we can successfully tie all of those together, we probably don't need that last third block. The problem, of course, has a little bit to do, Madam Chair and Councilmember Lilligren, with the Councilmember Lilligren was talking about, which is that we're taking up all of that one block here with all of that transit queuing and all of that, and there may be kind of a big idea to tighten that up a little bit. So if we can figure out a way to, with good planning, to take some of that and actually integrate it, maybe we don't need that last third block. So I think that is, frankly, just an ongoing discussion, and thank you guys for dealing with our civil-like view of development. Thank you.
Councilmember Gordon, you have the floor.
And I'll just add, if I thought that that third of a block would bring in enough money to actually build out the park, that's something that would be appealing to me as well. Partly, it's almost like, and I'm glad that we heard from you, because now I can start walking around saying it's a block and a half of park we're probably going to end up with, because you're probably going to want to build on that. But now we're also locking in what you pay for it. And I'm concerned about that too. So I'm tempted to say, would it be a deal breaker if we bumped it up to 3.5? But I won't ask you to come up and say that, because we don't talk about deal breakers in a situation like this. But so I'm just to say that is appealing. So if you can come up, Councilmember Goodman, maybe with a way to look at what is the value of it and what might the value be in 2016, and maybe it's different than what it is today, and maybe we want to hedge on that a little and leave some openings in the final terms and agreements. Thanks for indulging all my questions.
Anyone else? Councilmember Samuels.
Just have a question about the timing of the construction vis-a-vis the Viking Stadium, and how the demand for labor and all plays into that.
And the
Supply.
And I think I'll ask Mr. Collins to address the timing issue of labor, because obviously the Stadium Authority is going to take the equivalent of like 7,500 FTEs in order to get it built and open by July of 2016. And I know the Stadium Authority is moving aggressively to hire employment assistance firm to do that training piece, to make sure that there are available workers on site. But those workers would not just be project specific. I mean, they're going to be learning skills that can be then transferred over to the Ryan development. In terms of timing of the two projects, the Ryan development would be underway in mid-2014, correct, Mr. Collins? April of 2014, and would be open in 2015. Late
quarter of 16.
First quarter of 16. And the stadium would be open in July of 2016, which means these projects really are going to be coterminous in terms of not only calendar, but also their needs for workers. So,
Okay. I am going to move approval of the staff recommendation. I have a couple of comments I'd like to make, but I'll put on the floor to move approval. I want to note this is concept approval. We're not here to negotiate with the audience the details of any of the financing or any of the land use approvals. We're here to say we're in, we think this is a good idea, let's dedicate the staff time that's needed in excess of what's already been spent to figure out how we can make this happen. So that's why we're here today, to make sure that there wasn't a first step and a bump in the road, but a smooth first step. I also want to just note, I think it's really smart for us to use our position in the city and our planning documents to dictate where Class A office buildings are going to be placed in the city. I think that's a very smart move. I think it's a very savvy move. I personally think that if a number of employees were moved to this location that Wells Fargo owned, That would be better than Ryan building a speculative building and flooding the market with 1 million square feet of spec space that people would then leave their other Class B and C office spaces for. So I think what's happened here is actually very strategic, and it's exactly what cities could and should be doing, identifying locations where we want to see development, trying to drive it to that direction, and maybe get the icing on the cake, which is it would be owned versus speculative space. So I think that is all extremely good. From my point of view, as someone who did not support the stadium deal, this is not the stadium deal. This isn't even close to the stadium deal because it achieves the 3 primary goals that people like me, and everyone's not like me, think are important in doing a development deal. Number 1, this is a deal that's growing the tax base. It's not using the tax base. There is no tax increment financing involved in this deal. When 6,000 employees and 400 plus residents move into this area, they will have a need for services, and we will not be using the tax increment generated by their being there to provide, to take away from those services that they need. They'll be paying in. We will have the money to provide services. This is something that's growing the base so that everyone else won't have to pay for the services that they will need as we redevelop this part of town. Number 2, I believe that we're doing what we can, and we will continue through the negotiation to minimize our risk. I do not want to be the person handing off to someone sitting here 25 years from now, Gaviday, Target Center, Block E. Well, I was here for that. I was against that, but I'm the only one left. I want to look back on this 25 years from now and say this was a positive, transformative thing that minimized risk to the taxpayers. And I believe the negotiations are completely on track to alleviate that concern. The last thing is I am not a supporter of corporate welfare, and this is not corporate welfare. This is us financing something, utilizing the one tool we have in our toolkit to issue bonds to finance a project. We are not funding it. We're not giving them any money, not one penny. They would love for us to do that, I'm sure. That's not what we're doing. We're using our tool to finance something to spur development in a location that we believe as we grow out the city is important to grow in. So as the person who represents this neighborhood, 100% of it, as we sit here right now, with the very strong support of the Business Association and the Neighborhood Association in this area, and as someone who has been a champion for Wells Fargo for 15 years now, through better or for worse, I think it's great that you're making a commitment, should everything move forward, to putting a large headquarters, Class A, owned office building in this location. This is the kind of development we should be doing. This is the kind of development we should be proud of, and I really honestly believe that we should thank RT and Barb Johnson and Ryan and Susan Siegel and Chuck Lutz and Jeremy Hansen and Kevin Carpenter for really bringing forward something that could unite us in this area, not something that will create more controversy and more negativity for something that is so desperately needed in this area. The elimination of 5 surface parking lots in and of itself is a benefit, but working with our partners at Wells Fargo is like icing on the cake. So I am proud to move approval of this today and thank our staff and the leadership of the mayor for making this happen. Further comments or questions? Councilmember Gordon.
Well, I am supportive generally of the framework. I'm a little bit on the fence, and I may not necessarily vote for this right now coming out of committee because I think there's too much detail in the framework, and I think it's a mistake for us to say how much they get to pay with their option to buy at this point in the game and going through the council right now. And so I just want to raise that objection. Even if they did have an option to buy till 2016, and we didn't actually name the price now, but we could at an agreeable price, appraised value, come up with something that's a little more open right now than to actually name the price of what it's going to be worth 2 years from now. I'd feel much better about it. Or simply said, you have it now, I guess, if we thought we were, if you were really going to go forward. That's kind of the issue that I have right now. That's a small issue. The general framework, the general possibility, the potential for what we have to leverage out of all of this is pretty enormous, and I really appreciate. I think that Ryan really took the lead in kind of stepping up and coming forward on all of this, and I think without them being interested and helping bring Wells Fargo, we wouldn't be here. So I think that's they deserve an enormous amount of credit, as does everybody else involved. But since it's going by my desk right now and I have a chance to vote and bring up concerns that I have that I think maybe will be in the public interest, I thought I'd better do so.
Councilmember Lilligren.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'm going to support your motion today, and I want to thank all of the partners and team members that have been working on this. And I think one of my biggest concerns moving forward with the new stadium plan was looking at the conditions around the existing stadium. And I was here when it was built. I lived here when it was built. The big promise was that there would be development around the stadium, and you go on top of any of the parking ramps in the area and look down, and it's an ocean of surface parking. And so I really support your comment about eliminating the surface parking and adding this green amenity. And I think that when the stadium is built, if there isn't development, significant development right out of the gate, I think we're at risk of, in 20 years, having a city council sitting here looking at oceans of surface parking as well. And I do want to put out there that, again, that point about transit, and I want to express how much excitement and support there was at the Metropolitan Council Transportation Committee last night on this proposal. They were looking at some of the same images we're looking at here in committee today. There was a reference to the unique diagonal site created by the station here and wanting to maximize that. And as we go forward, I want to make sure that with the service, if there are any sort of service reform or service changes that are made to ease use of the station, that we are making sure to accommodate the transit needs here, because it really has the opportunity, as the mayor said, 2 lines come through here, the blue line, the green line, but as we kind of think of them in pieces today, we'd say there are 4 lines come through here, and this is just going to be such a significant spot on the entire regional transit system, and I want to make sure that that is acknowledged in however this design goes forward. Thanks.
On the chair's motion to approve the staff recommendation, all in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That item is approved. I do want to note that we have one receive and file item and an upcoming public hearing. If everyone would take note of those 2 items, seeing no further business before us, we are adjourned.